The gavel slammed down. "Pay the fine or face jail time." The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, filled with arrogance and power. The black man standing before him barely flinched. His calm demeanor unsettled the judge, but he dismissed it as defiance, just another man who needed to be put in his place. What Judge William Grant didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He thought this was just another case, another opportunity to abuse his authority and humiliate someone based on the color of their skin. He had done it countless times before, without consequence. But this time, he had picked the wrong man, because the man standing before him wasn't just another citizen. He was the governor of the state. And soon, the entire courtroom would witness justice turn against the very man who had twisted it for years. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more gripping stories. The courtroom was silent, except for the judge's gavel still vibrating against the wooden desk. Judge William Grant leaned back in his chair, staring at the black man standing before him. He smirked. Another nobody. Another fine. Another case dismissed. The room smelled of old books and polished wood, with dim lighting casting long shadows on the walls. The judge's portrait hung behind him, a reminder to all that he was the law in this small town. Marcus Reed stood tall, his expression calm. His deep brown eyes didn't show anger, only patience. He had dealt with men like this before. He knew their arrogance, their hunger for power. He also knew that men like Judge Grant always believed their authority was unshakable, until it wasn't. But no one in the room knew who Marcus really was. To them, he was just a well-dressed black man in a tailored gray suit, standing trial for a minor traffic violation. A broken taillight, they said. But in this town, that was enough of an excuse for a judge like Grant to abuse his power. Judge Grant was a man who enjoyed control. He had been on the bench for over 20 years, handing out harsh sentences to those he believed didn't belong in his town. His gray hair was neatly combed back, his gold-rimmed glasses resting at the tip of his nose. His reputation was clear. Black men didn't stand a chance in his courtroom. He had fined, jailed, and humiliated countless people of color, all while hiding behind the law. His rulings were rarely questioned, because who would dare stand against him? Today, he thought this case would be like any other. He would issue a fine. The man would either pay or protest, and if he protested, the consequences would be severe. But this time, the script was about to change. Marcus was not the kind of man who lost his temper easily. He had faced bigger challenges in life than a racist judge with a small-town ego. As the judge sneered at him from behind the bench, Marcus kept his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. He didn't need to prove anything to this man, though the courtroom didn't know it yet. Marcus was not an ordinary man. He was the governor of the state. He had come to this town in plain clothes, without security, without his title. He believed that true leaders should walk among the people without privilege or power. But today, that decision would expose just how deep the corruption in this town ran. Around the room, bystanders sat quietly, some looking away to avoid trouble, others whispering in hushed tones. A young black woman sitting in the back clutched her purse tightly, as if she had seen too many cases like this before. A bailiff shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Marcus and the judge. Something about the way Marcus carried himself didn't feel right. He wasn't acting like a man afraid of the judge's power. He was too calm, too controlled, too confident. Judge Grant, oblivious to the growing tension, flipped through the case file lazily. He barely read it. He never did. In his mind, this case was already over. The fine had already been set. The man standing before him was just another name on a long list of troublemakers he could silence with his gavel. Marcus took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the wooden table in front of him. He had hoped this town was different. He had hoped that justice, at least here, still meant something. But now, as he looked at the man sitting in the judge's chair, he knew what he had to do. He would not fight for himself. He would fight for every person who had ever been silenced in this courtroom. Judge Grant finally looked up, his cold eyes locking onto Marcus. "Let's make this quick," he said, smirking. "I have more important cases to handle." Marcus gave a small smile. The judge had no idea that he was the one on trial today. Judge Grant tapped his fingers on the desk, his patience wearing thin. He had been through countless cases like this, and to him, this was just another black man trying to argue his way out of a fine. His smirk deepened as he picked up the case file, barely giving it a glance before setting it down with a loud thud. "Let's make this quick," he said, looking directly at Marcus. "I have more important cases to handle." Marcus didn't react. He stood tall, hands resting lightly on the wooden defense table. He had dealt with men like Judge Grant before, men who mistook authority for superiority. The courtroom tenses. The air inside the courtroom felt heavy, as if everyone knew something was about to go wrong but didn't dare to speak. The bailiff shifted his weight uneasily. A woman sitting in the back row gripped her purse, her face unreadable. A young black man near the door clenched his jaw, staring at the judge with quiet fury. Marcus took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. He wasn't angry, not yet. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm, "I would like to contest this fine." Judge Grant scoffed loudly, leaning forward. "Contest it," he repeated mockingly. "And what exactly do you think you're going to argue? That you weren't speeding? That you didn't break the law?" Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. "Actually, I wasn't speeding, and the law doesn't justify the fine you're imposing." The judge laughed. "Well, isn't that cute? You think you can walk in here, play lawyer, and tell me how to do my job?" Marcus remained silent. His confidence wasn't arrogance, it was certainty, and that certainty was starting to make the judge uncomfortable. Judge Grant's bias becomes clear. The judge sighed dramatically and turned to the court clerk. "Read out the charge." The clerk, a nervous-looking woman with glasses, hesitated for a second before reading from the document. The defendant, Marcus Reed, was pulled over for a broken taillight. The officer reported no additional violations. "The standard fine for this offense is $50. Marcus folded his arms. $50. That was the correct fine. Yet, in front of him, the judge had scribbled down an amount 10 times higher, $500. "Now, Your Honor," Marcus said smoothly, tilting his head, "why is my fine 10 times the legal amount?" The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Grant's expression darkened. His game had been exposed, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Because I said so," he snapped. "And if you question my authority again, I'll make it even higher." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The injustice was blatant now, but no one dared to challenge the judge. Marcus tapped his fingers against the table. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the system, the corruption, the unchecked power, the way men like Judge Grant use their authority to control and oppress, and Marcus had had enough. "Your Honor," Marcus said slowly, "I'm asking you to follow the law." Judge Grant's face turned red. "Are you telling me how to run my courtroom?" he hissed. Marcus shrugged slightly. "I'm reminding you of your duty." The judge stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't get to demand anything from me," he growled. "In this room, I decide what's fair. And since you don't seem to understand how things work, let me make it clear. Your fine is now doubled." $1,000, gasps echoed across the courtroom. A man in the audience whispered, "This isn't right." The young black man near the door clenched his fists. "This is a joke." Marcus, however, remained still, his face unreadable. Judge Grant smirked again, thinking he had won. "Now, unless you want to argue some more," the judge continued, "pay the fine, or I'll have you escorted to jail." Marcus didn't even blink. Instead, he took a step forward, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of finality. "Are you sure that's the decision you want to make, Your Honor?" The judge narrowed his eyes. "Are you threatening me?" Marcus shook his head. "No, I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing." For the first time, Judge Grant hesitated. Something about the way Marcus spoke, the quiet certainty in his voice, the complete lack of fear, it felt wrong. People didn't stand up to him. They didn't challenge him like this. "Enough," the judge snapped, shaking off the strange feeling creeping into his chest. "Bailiff, escort this man out if he refuses to comply." The bailiff hesitated. Something was off. He had seen hundreds of cases like this, had watched Judge Grant abuse his power over and over, but there was something different about Marcus. It was in his posture, his words, his presence. The bailiff took a step forward, about to follow orders, when the courtroom doors suddenly burst open. A court clerk rushed inside, her face pale, hands shaking as she held a folder of documents. She ran up to the judge, whispering something urgent. The judge's smirk disappeared instantly. His face turned white. His hands trembled as he looked down at the paper she had just handed him. It was an official government document, and in bold letters at the top of the page, it read, "Marcus Reed, Governor of the State." Judge Grant's smirk vanished instantly. His face turned pale as his eyes scanned the document in front of him. His hands trembled slightly, and for the first time the arrogant judge looked afraid. Marcus Reed, the black man he had just illegally fined and mocked, wasn't just some nobody. He was the governor of the state. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Every single person, jurors, clerks, audience members, watched as the reality sank in. The same man Judge Grant had tried to humiliate, the man he had dismissed as just another powerless citizen, had more power than anyone in that room. Marcus stands his ground. Marcus stepped forward, his face calm as ever. "Is there a problem, Your Honor?" His voice was smooth, unwavering. Judge Grant swallowed hard. His arrogance cracked for just a second, but he quickly tried to recover. This can't be right." He cleared his throat, gripping the document tightly. There must be some mistake. The court clerk, still standing beside him, shook her head quickly. "No mistake, sir. He is the governor. His identity has been verified." A wave of whispers spread through the courtroom. A man near the back muttered, "Oh, my God, this is huge." A woman gasped, covering her mouth. He tried to fine the governor. Illegally. The bailiff, who had been ready to escort Marcus out just moments ago, froze in place. Everything had changed in an instant. Judge Grant tries to regain control. The judge's fingers tightened around the edges of his desk as he tried to maintain his composure. This doesn't change anything," he stammered. "In my courtroom, everyone is treated the same, regardless of their title." Marcus finally let out a small chuckle. Not of amusement, but disbelief. "That's an interesting claim, Your Honor," he said, "because just a moment ago, you were treating me very differently." The judge's eyes flickered with panic, but he shook his head. "You refused to pay the fine. That's all there is to it." Marcus didn't even blink. "You mean the fine that was 10 times higher than the legal amount?" He took another step forward, his voice cutting through the air. "The fine you raised to $1,000 just because I questioned your ruling." The tension in the room grew thicker. Judge Grant tried to laugh, but it came out forced and shaky. "I was well within my right to abuse your authority," Marcus interrupted. His tone was still calm, but now there was a dangerous edge to it. The judge flinched. Marcus turned to the audience, addressing the room as a whole. "How many of you have been in this same position?" he asked, his deep voice echoing in the courtroom. "How many of you have stood here powerless, while this man doubled, tripled, or even created fake fines just because he could?" No one spoke, but the looks on their faces said everything. A young black woman in the front row nodded slowly, her eyes filled with emotion. A middle-aged man near the back crossed his arms and muttered, "Too many times to count." Marcus turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, you've ruled over this court for decades, unchecked, unquestioned." He folded his hands in front of him. "But today, the system you've manipulated will hold you accountable." Judge Grant's last attempt to escape. The judge's panic finally broke through his facade. I didn't know who you were," he nearly shouted. "If I had known—" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "If you had known what? You would have treated me fairly, given me justice." The judge opened his mouth but had no answer. "So, justice is only for those in power," Marcus pressed. "What about every other person who walked through those doors? Did they deserve to be treated the way you treated me?" The judge's lips trembled. He had no way out. The reality was clear. He had exposed himself. The judge faces public judgment. The courtroom was no longer on the judge's side. People who had once feared him were now whispering, glaring, shaking their heads. A local reporter who had been sitting quietly in the back pulled out his phone and started recording. "Judge Grant," Marcus said, his voice steady but powerful, "I will personally ensure that every case you've handled is reviewed. Every unfair ruling, every abuse of power, it all comes to light now." The judge collapsed back into his chair, defeated. His hands trembled as he realized what was happening. Everything he had built, all the power he had abused, was crumbling right in front of him. The final blow. A sudden knock on the courtroom door made everyone jump. A uniformed officer stepped inside, holding an official document. "Judge William Grant," the officer announced, his voice firm, "by order of the governor's office, you are hereby placed under investigation for judicial misconduct and abuse of power." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The judge looked like he was about to faint. Marcus nodded to the officer. "Please escort His Honor out of my courtroom." The irony was not lost on anyone. As Judge Grant was led away, his face red with shame, Marcus turned to the crowd one last time. "This is why we fight injustice," he said, "because no one, not even a judge, is above the law." The entire courtroom stood and applauded. For the first time in years, justice had truly been served. The heavy courtroom doors slammed shut as Judge William Grant was escorted out, his once powerful presence reduced to that of a disgraced man. The very bench he had ruled from for decades now felt miles away, his footsteps slow and unsteady. The room remained silent for a moment, absorbing the shock of what had just unfolded. Then, slowly, whispers turned into hushed conversations. Marcus Reed stood at the front of the courtroom, watching it all unfold. But he wasn't done yet. He turned to the clerk, his expression calm yet firm. "How long has he been doing this?" The clerk swallowed nervously, glancing at the empty judge's seat before looking back at Marcus. "For years," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "People complained, but nothing ever changed." Marcus nodded, taking in her words. This wasn't just about today. It wasn't just about him. It was about an entire system that had allowed this corruption to thrive. As Marcus scanned the crowd, he saw a mix of emotions on every face. Some people looked relieved. Others were still too shocked to process what had just happened. Then, a voice broke the silence. "Governor Reed, what happens now?" Marcus turned his head toward the sound. It was the young black man who had been watching everything from the back of the courtroom, his hands still clenched into fists. His voice carried both curiosity and a hint of hope. Marcus let out a small breath before responding. "Now, we fix this." The same officer who had taken Judge Grant into custody stepped forward, holding a thick file of documents. "Governor, we've been looking into his records. It's worse than we thought." Marcus took the folder and flipped it open. Pages upon pages of names, case numbers, and wrongful rulings. The young black woman in the front row leaned forward, recognizing something. "That's my brother's name," she whispered, pointing at one of the cases. "He was sentenced unfairly by Grant 2 years ago." More people began murmuring, realizing their own connections to the judge's rulings. A middle-aged man crossed his arms and nodded. "I lost my business because of his fines. He was running a racket, targeting people he thought couldn't fight back." It was all becoming painfully clear. Judge Grant hadn't just been a biased man on a power trip. He had systematically destroyed lives, using his position to oppress and steal under the guise of justice. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, Judge Grant sat in a holding room, his hands shaking as he stared at the floor. He had been untouchable for so long that he had never imagined a day like this could come. A police officer stood guard at the door, avoiding his gaze. "You can't do this to me," Grant muttered, his voice breaking. "I've run this courtroom for 20 years. I know the law better than anyone." The officer scoffed. "Then you should have known better." Judge Grant looked up, his face a mixture of anger and desperation. "I didn't know who he was." The officer raised an eyebrow. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" Grant's mouth opened slightly, as if to argue, but no words came out. Because deep down, he knew. It wasn't about who Marcus Reed was. It was about how he had treated people when he thought they had no power. And now, he was powerless. Back in the courtroom, Marcus closed the file and looked at the faces around him. "We're going to make this right," he said. "Every case he handled will be reviewed. Every fine, every unfair ruling overturned." The crowd murmured in agreement, hope replacing fear. The young man who had spoken earlier stood up. "Governor, does this mean we can finally trust the system?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell them justice had been restored. But the truth was, this was just one judge. There were more, many more. So instead, he said, "This is only the beginning." The young man nodded slowly, understanding the weight of those words. Change wasn't a single act. It was a fight, and Marcus was ready for it. The very next day, Judge Grant's resignation letter was made public. But it wasn't just that. An official investigation had been launched. Marcus ensured that every person the judge had wrongfully convicted received justice. And Judge Grant, his days of passing judgment were over. The news spread like wildfire. Judge Grant had resigned. His reputation, once untouchable, was now in ruins. But his resignation wasn't enough. The state had launched a full investigation into his cases. The damage he had done over the years was far greater than anyone had imagined. Marcus Reed sat in his office, a thick stack of files spread out in front of him. Each one represented a person who had suffered under Grant's rulings, unjust fines, unfair prison sentences, lives ruined by one man's unchecked power. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Exposing Grant was just the first step. Justice wasn't about bringing one corrupt man down. It was about fixing the system that allowed him to exist in the first place. Meanwhile, in a small, dimly lit holding cell, Judge Grant sat alone. His expensive suit was now wrinkled, his hands clasped together. His once confident smirk had vanished. A guard walked past his cell and stopped. "Funny, isn't it?" The guard tilted his head. "You sentenced so many people to this place, and now here you are." Judge Grant looked away. He had spent his entire career believing he was above the law, but now, for the first time, he felt what it was like to be powerless. The door opened, and his lawyer walked in, looking grim. "You have a choice, William," the lawyer said, placing a folder on the table in front of him. "You can cooperate, expose others who are part of this, or go down alone." The former judge hesitated, staring at the papers. He had once ruled over people with an iron grip, but now he was just another criminal in the eyes of the law. For the first time in his life, he realized what true justice felt like. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere was different now. People weren't afraid to speak up anymore. Those who had been silenced for years were now stepping forward, telling their stories. A woman who had lost her home due to an unfair ruling wept as her case was reopened. A young man, wrongfully sentenced by Grant, was finally released after years in prison. The town was changing, but not just because of Marcus. It was changing because people had found their voices again, and they weren't going to stay silent anymore. A week later, Marcus stood before a crowd of reporters and citizens, the courthouse standing tall behind him. He adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. "Today, we saw justice in action," he began, his voice carrying through the square. "But let me be clear, this is only the beginning." The crowd listened intently. Judge Grant was one man, a symptom of a much larger problem. But for too long, people like him have abused the system, believing they were untouchable. He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some were hopeful. Others were skeptical. They had seen men in power make promises before. Change doesn't come from one man, and it doesn't happen overnight. Marcus continued. It comes when we, as a people, refuse to accept injustice, when we stand up and say, "Enough." A few people in the crowd nodded in agreement. "That's why I'm launching a full investigation into every case Judge Grant handled. Every unjust ruling will be overturned. Every stolen dollar will be returned." Applause erupted. "But we're not stopping there," Marcus pressed on. "We are setting up a judicial review board, one that holds every judge accountable. No more unchecked power, no more silent victims." The applause grew louder. As Marcus stepped down, people began embracing one another. They had been divided for too long, by fear, by injustice. But today, they were standing together. The young man who had spoken up in court that day walked up to Marcus, his hands no longer clenched into fists. "Governor, I didn't think people like you actually fought for us." His voice was raw, honest. Marcus smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Justice belongs to everyone, but we have to fight for it, together." For the first time, the young man believed him. And for the first time in a long time, the town believed in justice again. As Marcus Reed stepped away from the podium, the crowd remained standing, their applause echoing through the courthouse square. The town had seen corruption fall before their eyes, but more importantly, they had witnessed justice being restored. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to demand their rights. They weren't afraid to hold those in power accountable. But Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. He turned back, looking up at the grand courthouse building. It had once symbolized oppression for many, but today it was a symbol of change. With a deep breath, He walked down the steps, disappearing into the crowd, not as a governor standing above them, but as a man standing with them. Justice isn't about titles, it's about truth. That was the lesson of the day. Judge Grant had power, but he had no justice. Marcus Reed had justice, and that gave him true power. But this isn't just a story about one judge. It's a story about every person who has ever been wronged by a broken system. Now, we ask you, do you think corrupt officials should be given a second chance, or should they face permanent consequences? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters. If you believe in fighting for justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that expose corruption and inspire change. Because justice isn't just a word, it's a movement. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.